So the second protectionist policy that we're going to look at is going to be quotas or voluntary export restrictions. So quotas or VERs, so voluntary export restrictions. And so what a quota is it restricts the amount that's allowed to be imported into the country, the amount of the good that can be imported. So it just places a limit on the amount of imports. And so what a VER is just the country who's actually exporting the good that's, let's say, imported into Canada. So Canada would put on a quota. Another thing that could happen is this other country, this country that's exporting the good, could voluntarily just restrict the amount that they're going to export to a country. This is when the exporting country agrees to limit the amount of the good that they export. Limit the amount they export. You might think it's a little bit weird that a country would voluntarily do this, but this is maybe to stop something else from happening, or for tariffs or something like that to be putting in place. All right, so let's quickly erase this board, and then we can kind of draw, just like we did for tariffs, we can draw out the effect of these quotas on our diagram, and then talk about kind of the welfare implications over here. So again, let's just draw out our diagram of what this industry looks like. So we have this domestic supply curve, this domestic demand curve. Where they meet is going to determine I'm just going to continue this on a little bit more. Where they meet is going to be the autarky price. But because we already know they're importing, we have this world price that's less than this autarky price. So let's imagine this PW is this world price. Well, that would give us this Q0 and Q1, or Q1 and Q2, however you want to label it. And so this distance between them is the amount of imports before any kind of quota. But then let's say the government comes along and says, actually you're only allowed to import a certain amount. And let's say it's this amount here. We can call it Q whatever, QQ for the quantity of the quota. And so what that's going to do is just going to create a wedge between the suppliers, the domestic suppliers, and the domestic demand curve equal to that amount. And so this is we label it Q3 and Q4, this distance here is the quota. And so what that's going to do is it's going to raise the price in the domestic market. So this is the new price after the quota. And so, again, the imports are going to fall because if it's binding, if this quota is binding, the imports are going to fall from this amount here to this amount, because that's how much we're restricting it. Like that's how much the Canadian government is restricting it, for instance. And so we see again that when the price is higher, domestic production is going to increase from Q1 to Q3, just like before. And then domestic quantity demanded is going to fall from Q2 to Q4. But again, in terms of the welfare effects, we can label these again. And again, the domestic producer surplus is going to go up by this area, right? Below the price, above the supply curve, well, it used to be this smaller triangle here, but now it's this bigger one here. So it's gone up by this area 1. So domestic producer surplus has increased by this area 1. For the same reasons as we just talked about, the consumer surplus the domestic consumer surplus is going to fall by these 4 areas. Oops, I guess I'm not saying by, so let's just erase that. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, so it's falling by those 4 areas since the price is higher. If you remember under tariffs, this area 3 used to be government revenue. But now we're not charging a tariff when the country, when some goods enter our country. We're just restricting how many of these goods. And so this area 3 is not going to be government revenue anymore. In fact, it's increasing the producer surplus of these foreign firms. Use a different color here. So foreign firms, producer surplus is going to increase by this area 3. Well, if we're thinking about the implications for the Canadian efficiency, this means now that deadweight loss is going to be equal to, oops, not area 1, areas 2, 3, and 4, because Canada's not counting this, how this producer surplus is increasing for foreign firms. We just care what's happening in this market. And so we're going to see that producer surplus is going up by 1, but it's decreasing by 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so we're going to have a deadweight loss of these last 3 areas. So now the deadweight loss is going to be this whole area here. So we can see that having an import tariff is going to have cause a lesser inefficiency. That can wrap your head around that sentence. It's going to cause less of an inefficiency than these import quotas. These import quotas are going to cause a larger deadweight loss. So when we think about the tariffs versus quotas, these two policies are going to have different welfare implications towards these two countries, the exporter and the importer. So let's quickly write that down. Tariffs versus quotas. So in general, these two policies have different welfare effects. Have different welfare implications for the two countries. And by the two countries, I mean the country who's exporting and the country who's importing. And so in general, we're going to think that, hopefully this pen will work, the exporting country, so the country who's exporting this good and sending it to this other country is going to prefer a quota. And so if you remember from those diagrams on the welfare implications, remember under a quota, some of that, when that quota came into effect, some of that area was producer surplus that went to foreign firms. And so this foreign firm, the exporting country, prefers this quota and prefers it over a tariff, because if you remember the tariff, that area was transferred to the government of the importing country. So importing countries are going to prefer the tariffs. Because they got to collect that extra revenue. So that's the real trade-off here, or that's a real difference between these two protectionist policies.